Some stories become legends because they grow larger with every retelling, but this one became legendary because the evidence never disappeared. High in the rugged mountains surrounding Monte Cassino, where steep rocky slopes challenged every convoy and every supply route, soldiers of the Polish Second Corps remembered fighting beside an unlikely companion whose name would eventually become known around the world. His name was Wojtek, and unlike every other member of the unit, he did not wear boots or salute his officers. He was a Syrian brown bear whose remarkable journey crossed continents before leading him to one of the most important battles of the Italian campaign during the Second World War. At first glance, the story almost sounds impossible. How could a bear become an official member of a military unit? How could an animal travel with soldiers through deserts, mountains, ports, and battlefields? Most surprising of all, why do so many veterans, photographs, military insignia, and museum exhibits continue telling the same extraordinary story decades after the war ended? Those questions have fascinated historians for generations because Wojciech's story is not built on folklore alone. It survives through wartime photographs, military records, eyewitness accounts, preserved artifacts, and the memories of Polish veterans who refused to let the world forget the unusual friend who shared both their hardships and their victories. Yet to understand why a bear would one day carry ammunition boxes during the Battle of Monte Cassino, we must begin long before Italy, long before the famous monastery overlooking the valley, and long before Wojciech became a symbol recognized far beyond Poland. The beginning of this story lies thousands of miles away in the Middle East during one of the darkest periods of the war, when countless Polish soldiers had already endured years of displacement, uncertainty, and exhausting travel across unfamiliar lands. These men were no longer simply fighting for territory. They were carrying with them the hope that one day they might return to a free homeland, even though many did not know whether that day would ever come. Life inside the Polish Second Corps demanded discipline, patience, and constant adaptation. Supplies were limited, living conditions were often difficult, and every new destination brought unfamiliar climates and cultures. Yet amid these challenges, the soldiers formed unusually close bonds with one another because survival depended not only on training, but also on friendship, humor, and shared purpose. None of them could have imagined that an unexpected encounter with a small orphan bear cub would transform the emotional spirit of their entire unit and eventually create one of the most unforgettable stories in military history. Before Wojciech became an international symbol of courage and companionship, before artists carved his likeness into monuments and museums displayed his photographs, he was simply a frightened young animal whose future seemed uncertain. The decision made by a handful of Polish soldiers in that quiet moment would change not only the bear's life, but also the identity of an entire military company, setting in motion a journey that would lead both men and bear toward the towering cliffs of Monte Cassino, where history would forever remember them together. The chance encounter that changed everything took place far from the mountains of Italy. In the spring of 1942, soldiers of the Polish Second Corps were moving through Persia, now known as Iran, after months of hardship that had carried them across unfamiliar lands. Their journey was part of a much larger movement of Polish forces that had been reorganized in the Middle East before eventually joining the Allied campaign in Italy. Along dusty roads and through small villages, the soldiers encountered countless reminders of how deeply the war had affected ordinary lives. It was during one of these stops that a young local boy approached the unit carrying a tiny Syrian brown bear cub, whose mother was believed to have been lost in the surrounding mountains. The cub was frightened, undernourished, and far too young to survive alone. Several soldiers immediately recognized that leaving the animal behind would almost certainly mean it had little chance of reaching adulthood. After a brief discussion, they decided to purchase the cub, not as a curiosity, but as an act of compassion that reflected the values they still carried despite years of displacement. Lieutenant Anatol Tarnowiecki and other members of the unit helped arrange the adoption, while the care of the young bear quickly became a shared responsibility among many soldiers. They named him Wojciech, a traditional Polish name meaning joyful warrior, though at that moment he was little more than a curious bundle of fur struggling to understand the unfamiliar world around him. Feeding such a young bear presented unexpected challenges because he was too small to eat solid food. The soldiers improvised by filling an empty bottle with condensed milk and attaching a cloth to create a simple feeding nipple. Wojtek quickly learned to recognize the voices and faces of the men who cared for him, following them through camp with growing confidence each passing day. His playful curiosity soon became a welcome distraction from the endless routines of military life. He enjoyed wrestling gently with the younger soldiers, chasing moving objects, and exploring every corner of the encampment with fearless enthusiasm. The men laughed as the cub copied their daily habits, often standing on his hind legs to observe whatever activity captured his attention. Although no one could have predicted his future role, it was already clear that Wojtek possessed an unusual intelligence and remarkable ability to adapt to human companionship. As weeks turned into months, the bear became more than a rescued animal. He became a source of comfort for soldiers separated from their families and homeland by thousands of miles. Around evening campfires, laughter returned more easily whenever Wojtek wandered between tents searching for attention or treats. The hardships of military life remained, but the presence of the growing bear reminded the unit that kindness could still exist even during global conflict. Every shared meal, every playful moment, and every mile traveled together strengthened the bond between Wojtek and the Polish soldiers. None of them realized that this remarkable friendship was quietly preparing both the bear and the men for a journey that would soon carry them across deserts, oceans, and finally toward the mountains of Italy, where their loyalty to one another would become part of one of the most enduring stories of the Second World War. Life inside the Polish Second Corps gradually transformed the curious bear cub into a familiar presence that no one could imagine living without. As Wojtek grew larger, so did his confidence, and the routines of military life became his routines as well. Each morning, he wandered through the camp, greeting familiar faces before following the soldiers as they completed their daily responsibilities. Veterans later recalled that he seemed to understand the rhythm of the unit remarkably well, appearing wherever people gathered and always showing genuine curiosity about the work taking place around him. His playful nature never disappeared, but it matured into something deeper as he developed strong bonds with the men who had rescued him months earlier. Wojtek quickly learned to imitate many of the habits he observed every day. He often stood upright beside the soldiers, accepted food directly from their hands, and eagerly joined them during periods of rest. Photographs from the time show him comfortably surrounded by smiling Polish troops, illustrating a level of trust that had developed naturally through constant companionship rather than deliberate training. The bear especially enjoyed sharing fresh fruit, honey, bread, and occasional treats offered by the men, while stories from veterans describe his fascination with bottles, water hoses, and almost anything new that appeared around camp. Every new destination became another opportunity for exploration, and Wojtek approached unfamiliar surroundings with an energy that often lifted the spirits of exhausted soldiers. Military camps were places of discipline, but they also depended on friendship and mutual support. For many members of the Polish Second Corps, Wojtek became an emotional anchor that reminded them of ordinary life beyond the hardships of war. Whenever long marches ended or difficult travel left everyone tired, the bear's playful behavior frequently brought laughter back into the camp. His presence encouraged conversations, strengthened friendships, and gave the soldiers something positive to focus on during uncertain times. Officers recognized that the bear contributed to morale in ways no official program ever could. He was not simply a mascot displayed for ceremonies. He lived among the men, traveled with them, and experienced the same long journeys across unfamiliar landscapes. As Wojtek continued growing, practical challenges also appeared. His increasing size attracted attention wherever the unit traveled, especially when transportation by rail or ship became necessary. Regulations governing military transport rarely included provisions for bears, creating unexpected logistical problems for officers responsible for moving the entire unit. To solve this issue, the Polish soldiers officially enlisted Wojtek into the ranks of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company. He received his own service number, ration allowance, and official status, allowing him to remain legally with the unit throughout its continuing deployment. While this unusual administrative decision often surprises modern audiences, Surviving records and photographs confirm that Wojtek became an acknowledged member of the company rather than remaining an unofficial camp animal. By the time the Polish Second Corps prepared to leave the Middle East and continue toward the Italian campaign, the bear had grown into a powerful adult whose loyalty to the men seemed unquestionable. None of the soldiers expected that the greatest test of their extraordinary friendship still lay ahead, waiting among the steep mountains and demanding supply routes surrounding Monte Cassino, where Wojtek's calm strength would soon become part of military history. By early 1944, the long journey that had begun in the Middle East brought the Polish Second Corps to Italy, where one of the most demanding objectives of the Allied campaign stood before them. Rising above the surrounding valleys, the mountains around Monte Cassino formed a natural barrier that had already challenged several previous offensives. Narrow roads wound through steep slopes, rocky terrain slowed every vehicle and nearly every supply. Required careful planning before it could reach the soldiers stationed higher in the mountains. Success depended not only on determination but also on an uninterrupted flow of food, water, medical equipment, and artillery ammunition. The 22nd Artillery Supply Company understood that their responsibility extended far beyond driving trucks or unloading cargo. Every crate delivered on time allowed the artillery batteries to continue supporting advancing infantry units, while every delay created new logistical problems across the difficult landscape. Wojtek had now reached full adulthood, standing far taller and stronger than the small cub the soldiers had rescued 2 years earlier. Despite his impressive size, those who knew him best continued treating him as a trusted companion rather than an attraction. He followed familiar routines, recognized the voices of the men in his company, and moved confidently around vehicles, equipment, and supply areas without showing signs of fear. Veterans later described how naturally he adapted to the constant activity surrounding military logistics, often watching workers unload crates before curiously approaching to investigate the same tasks himself. As preparations intensified, the company worked almost continuously to organize supplies before each movement. Wooden ammunition crates, fuel containers, engineering tools, food rations, communication equipment, and medical stores filled staging areas awaiting transport toward higher positions. Every member of the unit understood that careful coordination mattered as much as physical strength because the mountainous terrain left little room for mistakes. Wojtek remained close to the soldiers throughout these preparations, quietly observing the endless movement of vehicles and personnel while continuing to accompany the men wherever they worked. Numerous eyewitness accounts recorded after the war consistently describe his calm behavior amid the demanding pace of military life. Rather than becoming frightened by the noise and activity surrounding the supply company, he appeared remarkably comfortable among the people who had become his family. His presence continued lifting morale during long working days that often stretched from early morning until late evening. Laughter still followed him through the camp, reminding exhausted soldiers that moments of humanity could survive even in the most difficult environments. Yet as the company moved ever closer to the mountain, the scale of the logistical challenge became increasingly clear. Steep slopes, rough roads, and the enormous quantity of supplies required for sustained operations demanded every available pair of hands. Few could have imagined that the bear quietly walking beside them would soon demonstrate behavior so extraordinary that decades later it would become inseparable from the history of Monte Cassino itself. The remarkable events remembered by generations of Polish veterans were about to unfold, transforming Wojtek from a beloved companion into one of the most recognizable symbols of courage, teamwork, and perseverance associated with the Polish Second Corps. As the Polish Second Corps settled into its demanding role near Monte Cassino, the daily rhythm of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company became increasingly focused on one essential mission: keeping supplies moving across some of the most difficult terrain in Italy. Long before sunrise, trucks, trailers, and supply teams began organizing wooden crates filled with artillery ammunition, food, engineering equipment, and medical stores. Every shipment required careful coordination because the winding mountain roads left little room for delay, and every successful delivery strengthened the ability of the Polish forces to continue supporting Allied operations. Amid this constant activity, Wojtek remained exactly where the soldiers expected to find him, moving comfortably among familiar faces as though he fully understood that the entire company depended upon teamwork. Veterans later described how naturally he observed the routines around him. He watched men lifting heavy wooden crates, stacking supplies onto vehicles, and carrying equipment from one position to another. Having spent nearly 2 years living alongside soldiers, Wojtek had become accustomed to copying many of their everyday actions. His curiosity often encouraged him to investigate whatever the men were doing, whether they were unloading supplies, arranging camp equipment, or preparing vehicles for another journey. According to numerous eyewitness accounts recorded after the war, one remarkable habit soon attracted everyone's attention. Rather than merely watching, Wojtek began lifting wooden ammunition crates with his powerful front legs and carrying them over short distances in much the same way he had seen the soldiers doing. The men were astonished by how calmly and confidently he handled the heavy loads. Instead of treating the crates as unfamiliar objects, the bear appeared to regard the task as another shared activity with the companions he had trusted for years. The soldiers quickly realized that no one had trained him through formal instruction. Instead, his actions seemed to grow naturally from observation, imitation, and the deep bond he had developed with the unit. Every successful trip carrying a crate brought smiles across tired faces and reminded the company that even under demanding circumstances, unexpected moments of encouragement could appear. Wojtek never became a replacement for the soldiers performing their responsibilities, nor did anyone rely on him to determine the outcome of military operations. Historical accounts consistently present his contribution as an extraordinary example of companionship and morale rather than an exaggerated legend of battlefield heroics. Yet his willingness to participate alongside the men left a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed it. The sight of the large Syrian brown bear calmly transporting ammunition crates became one of the defining memories shared by members of the company long after the war had ended. Their stories remained remarkably consistent despite being told across different countries and many decades. Photographs, military insignia, and preserved recollections would later reinforce those memories, helping historians distinguish genuine events from popular embellishment. As the days passed, Wojtek's unusual participation spread throughout neighboring units, and visitors often stopped simply to see the remarkable bear working peacefully beside Polish soldiers. None of them could have known that these unforgettable moments would soon inspire an official emblem that would preserve Wojtek's image for generations, ensuring that his place in military history would extend far beyond the mountains where his extraordinary companionship first became known. As news of the remarkable bear spread through the Polish Second Corps, Wojtek gradually became far more than an unusual companion. He represented resilience, loyalty, and the ability to preserve humanity under extraordinary circumstances. Soldiers from neighboring units occasionally stopped by simply to catch a glimpse of the famous bear they had heard so much about, and many left with stories they would continue sharing for the rest of their lives. What impressed them most was not simply Wojtek's size, but the calm confidence with which he moved among the men. He did not behave like an animal separated from the company. Instead, he appeared completely at home within the routines of military life, recognizing familiar voices, responding to trusted handlers, and remaining close to the soldiers who had raised him since he was a frightened cub in Persia. During the weeks surrounding the campaign, eyewitness accounts repeatedly described the same pattern. Whenever the company organized supplies, Wojtek naturally approached the activity with curiosity and often participated by lifting wooden ammunition crates in a manner remarkably similar to the soldiers themselves. Veterans consistently emphasized that the bear never displayed panic despite the demanding environment. His familiar presence often brought moments of relief to men facing exhausting days of continuous logistical work. Those brief moments of laughter and surprise strengthened morale in ways impossible to measure, reminding everyone that companionship could survive even under the most difficult conditions. The extraordinary relationship between Wojtek and the soldiers eventually inspired an official decision that would preserve his memory forever. The 22nd Artillery Supply Company adopted a new emblem featuring the unmistakable image of a bear carrying an artillery shell. Unlike stories that emerged only through rumor, this symbol appeared on official company insignia and military vehicles, providing lasting historical evidence that Wojtek had become inseparable from the identity of the unit. Even decades later, preserved insignia, wartime photographs, and surviving artifacts continue confirming this remarkable connection. Historians studying the story often point to the emblem as one of the strongest visual reminders that Wojtek was not remembered merely as a camp mascot, but as a respected member of the company whose presence left an unforgettable impression on those who served beside him. Following the campaign, veterans consistently spoke about the bear with affection rather than exaggeration. They described him as a dependable companion whose greatest contribution extended beyond any single task. Wojtek represented hope during uncertainty, familiarity during constant movement, and friendship during years when many soldiers were separated from their homes and families. His story endured because countless independent witnesses recalled the same qualities of gentleness, intelligence, and trust that defined his relationship with the Polish troops. These consistent recollections helped transform an extraordinary wartime experience into one of the most thoroughly documented animal stories of the Second World War. Yet the war itself would eventually come to an end, bringing entirely new challenges. As victory approached, the soldiers who had spent years traveling across continents with their remarkable companion faced an uncertain future once again. The next chapter of Wojtek's life would no longer unfold on military roads or temporary camps, but in a peaceful land far from the mountains of Italy, where both the soldiers and the bear would discover that leaving the battlefield behind did not mean leaving the past behind. When the fighting in Italy finally gave way to the promise of peace, the soldiers of the Polish Second Corps quickly realized that victory did not automatically bring everyone home. The war had reshaped Europe, borders had changed, and many Polish servicemen faced painful uncertainty about where they could safely build a new life. For countless veterans, returning to their homeland was no longer a simple decision, and many instead continued their journey to the United Kingdom, carrying with them the memories of years spent crossing continents together. Among those making the journey was Wojtek, whose presence had become so closely connected to the identity of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company that leaving him behind was never considered an option. The bear who had once arrived in Persia as a frightened orphan now traveled as a cherished companion recognized by soldiers across the Corps. Eventually, the company settled in Scotland, where military camps gradually exchanged the urgency of wartime logistics for the slower routines of postwar life. Yet adapting to peace proved difficult for both men and animals. The soldiers faced uncertain futures, searching for employment, reconnecting with scattered families, and adjusting to a world transformed by 6 years of conflict. Wojtek experienced a different kind of transition. His remarkable size and strength made it increasingly difficult for him to remain within ordinary military facilities, and arrangements were eventually made for him to live at the Edinburgh Zoo, where his safety and long-term care could be properly maintained. Although this marked the end of daily life alongside the soldiers, it did not end their friendship. Former members of the Polish Second Corps visited Wojtek whenever possible, often bringing familiar foods that reminded both the bear and the veterans of their shared past. Many eyewitnesses later recalled that Wojtek seemed to recognize old companions by their voices long before they reached his enclosure. According to several veterans, calling his name in Polish would often draw an immediate response as the bear approached with the same calm curiosity that had once brightened military camps years earlier. Whether every memory survived perfectly unchanged cannot always be verified, but the remarkable consistency across numerous independent accounts illustrates the extraordinary bond that had developed between the soldiers and the animal they had raised together. Visitors to the zoo frequently heard stories explaining why this bear attracted so much attention from elderly Polish veterans, and many were surprised to discover that the photographs displayed beside his enclosure were authentic records from wartime rather than imaginative illustrations. Historians studying Wojtek's life found an unusually rich collection of evidence supporting his journey, including official military photographs, preserved insignia, written memoirs, interviews, and archival documents created by the men who knew him personally. Rather than fading into legend, his story became increasingly documented as surviving veterans recognized the importance of preserving first-hand testimony before it disappeared forever. With every passing decade, Wojtek came to symbolize far more than companionship between humans and animals. He represented resilience without hatred, loyalty without expectation of reward, and the remarkable capacity for kindness even during history's darkest chapters. As museums, memorials, and historians continued gathering evidence, it became clear that Wojtek's legacy was no longer carried only in memory. It had become part of the documented history of the Second World War, preparing the world to understand why generations continue honoring a bear whose extraordinary journey remains unlike any other. As the years passed, Wojtek's story quietly crossed national borders, reaching historians, museum curators, military researchers, and ordinary families who had never met the remarkable bear yet found themselves deeply moved by his journey. Unlike many wartime stories that gradually faded as eyewitnesses grew older, Wojtek's legacy continued expanding because it rested upon an unusually strong foundation of preserved evidence. Official photographs captured him standing among Polish soldiers. Military insignia bearing the image of a bear carrying an artillery shell survived in collections and museums. Veterans recorded detailed memoirs describing daily life with their unusual companion, while historians compared these personal recollections with surviving documents to better understand the extraordinary relationship between Wojtek and the 22nd Artillery Supply Company. Although certain individual memories naturally differed in small details, the central narrative remained remarkably consistent across independent sources collected over many decades. This consistency strengthened confidence that the core events surrounding Wojtek's life reflected genuine historical experience rather than later invention. Museums in several countries gradually incorporated his story into exhibitions exploring the Polish contribution to the Second World War. Visitors who had never heard of Wojtek often stopped in surprise before photographs showing an enormous Syrian brown bear standing peacefully beside uniformed soldiers. Children were captivated by the unlikely friendship, while adults frequently paused to read the accompanying historical explanations, discovering that the bear's journey represented far more than an entertaining curiosity. It reflected the resilience of displaced soldiers who preserved compassion even while enduring enormous uncertainty. Public memorials further reinforced Wojtek's place in history. Bronze statues depicting the bear carrying an artillery shell now stand in locations connected to the Polish wartime experience, including Scotland, England, and Poland itself. Rather than celebrating conflict, these memorials honor loyalty, friendship, and the remarkable bond that developed between people and an animal under extraordinary circumstances. Annual commemorations, educational programs, and historical publications continue introducing new generations to Wojtek's story, ensuring that it remains part of a broader understanding of the human experiences surrounding the Second World War. Researchers also continue examining archival materials to distinguish carefully documented evidence from later embellishments, demonstrating the importance of preserving historical accuracy while appreciating the emotional power of the narrative. What emerges from this ongoing scholarship is not a mythical creature performing impossible feats, but a real Syrian brown bear whose life became intertwined with one of the most respected Polish military formations of the war. His significance lies not only in the memorable image of carrying ammunition crates, but also in the comfort, stability, and optimism he provided to men living far from home during years of uncertainty. For countless veterans, Wojtek represented continuity when nearly everything else in life had changed. That emotional truth appears repeatedly throughout memoirs, interviews, and family recollections preserved long after the conflict ended. Today, visitors standing before Wojtek's statues or viewing his photographs often leave with the same realization shared by those Polish soldiers many decades earlier. History is not shaped only by famous generals or political leaders. Sometimes its most enduring symbols emerge through unexpected friendships that remind people of compassion, trust, and shared purpose. Those enduring values explain why Wojtek continues to inspire audiences around the world, setting the stage for the final reflection on how one rescued bear became an unforgettable part of documented military history and why his legacy continues to matter today. Looking back across the extraordinary journey of Wojtek, what remains most remarkable is not simply that a Syrian brown bear traveled with soldiers through the Second World War. It is that his story continues to stand up to careful historical examination more than 80 years later. Historians have compared wartime photographs, official military insignia, preserved documents, veteran memoirs, interviews, and museum collections, and together these sources paint a remarkably consistent picture of an animal whose life became inseparable from that of the Polish Second Corps. While certain details naturally vary from one personal recollection to another, the broader historical record leaves little doubt that Wojtek existed, traveled with the unit from the Middle East to Italy, became officially enlisted in the 22nd Artillery Supply Company, inspired the famous company emblem featuring a bear carrying an artillery shell, and remained a beloved companion long after the fighting had ended. Those facts alone would make his story extraordinary, but the deeper reason people continue remembering Wojtek reaches beyond military history. He represents something rarely captured in official reports or strategic maps. During years defined by uncertainty, displacement, and sacrifice, the bond between the soldiers and their remarkable companion offered a sense of stability that many desperately needed. The men who cared for Wojtek had lost homes, endured long journeys across unfamiliar countries, and faced an uncertain future, yet they still found room for compassion toward a frightened orphaned bear cub. In return, Wojtek offered something impossible to measure with statistics or military records. His quiet presence reminded exhausted soldiers of friendship, normal life, and hope during moments when those qualities often seemed distant. That emotional connection explains why former members of the Polish Second Corps continued visiting him in Scotland years after the war ended, and why they spoke about him with genuine affection rather than exaggeration. Today, visitors standing before monuments dedicated to Wojtek or viewing his photographs in museums are not simply learning about an unusual animal. They are discovering an authentic chapter of history that demonstrates how resilience can be strengthened by kindness and how trust can grow between entirely different species under extraordinary circumstances. Educators frequently use Wojtek's story to introduce younger generations to the broader history of the Polish armed forces during the Second World War, because his journey provides a deeply human perspective on events often remembered only through dates, maps, and military campaigns. His life encourages curiosity, invites further research, and reminds audiences that history is filled with unexpected stories waiting to be rediscovered through careful evidence rather than myth alone. Perhaps that is why Wojtek continues inspiring people across the world. He never sought recognition, medals, or fame, yet he became one of the most recognizable symbols associated with the Polish Second Corps because of loyalty, companionship, and quiet determination. Long after the mountains of Monte Cassino fell silent, long after the soldiers laid aside their uniforms, and long after the war itself became history, the image of a bear carrying an artillery shell still reminds the world that courage sometimes appears in the most unexpected forms, and that even amid humanity's greatest trials, compassion can leave a legacy that endures for generations.